made the mainstream. The problem is there's really only a handful of companies, cannabis companies, that are listed on the major exchanges like an NYSE and a NASDAQ. And many of them are on junior exchanges here um, in the US. And only a few are on the major exchanges in Canada, which really don't compare in size. So I think the reason it doesn't get a lot of coverage by mainstream media is that there just aren't enough good companies to talk about. But at least they are talking about it, and the regulators are paying attention.
That's interesting. And it seems there were some laws. I don't know if it was going to be part of the Safe Banking Act, but something that would open up the U.S. exchanges, because there are a couple that are traded on the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ, but they're few and far between. And I'm not really sure what the regulations are in terms of bringing them here, but are they mainly Canadian companies that are trading on the U.S. Stock Exchange? I don't think they're U.S. companies.
That's it, precisely it. So to be on the major exchanges like NASDAQ and NYSE, the companies can't be breaking federal law. So they are Canadian companies that have Canadian operations. And of course, it's federally legal in Canada. So they're not breaking any law, and they can list. But there's also a few CBD companies. There's one called CBDMD. Their ticker is YCBD, and they're on the New York Stock Exchange. And they're not breaking laws either, because they're abiding by the hemp bill in providing hemp-derived CBD. And so as long as you're abiding by the federal guidelines, but you're right, if you're touching cannabis and you're US-based and you're operating in the US, you can really only be listed on Canadian exchanges as your major exchange, and then on the over-the-counter here in the US, which is a junior exchange. You can't be on the NASDAQ or the NYSE.
And per your reporting, do you think that that's really going to hamper or limit some of these companies from actually getting the capital that they need?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's interesting. A few years ago, you saw an influx of US companies that had US cannabis operations list on the Canadian Stock Exchange in Canada, the CSE. And they were the only exchange, Canadian exchange, that allowed US companies that were essentially breaking federal law to list on their exchange. And in doing so, that allowed these companies to gain capital through Canadian banks and even US banks that were then being affiliates in Canada. So it really did help the whole industry grow. Many of the top cannabis companies that are in the US, multi-state operators, they are all listed on the CSE, and it was important for them because it allowed them to get that funding. But now that funding is tighter and it's harder to get, not being on a major US exchange really hurts the companies because they can't access institutional capital. And that's why the banking and the federal laws need to change so that cannabis companies can be treated like mainstream companies and access capital the way that other companies do.
And what about the private equity funds that are supporting a lot of these startups and even some getting, raising capital for some of the larger operations as well? Some of them are public companies, aren't they? What makes it okay for them to do that legally? Do you know?
Well, there's accredited investors that meet a certain criteria in terms of their income and assets. They can invest in private cannabis companies, and that is a very important way for private cannabis companies that are not public to access capital. And these accredited investors have formed groups and entities, even public entities, and they can invest in them. But of course, if they go public and they're in the U.S., operating in the U.S., they have to list on a Canadian exchange.
Right. So, yeah, it's just it's all interesting.
And we're also seeing what's interesting, Snowden, is we are now also seeing crowdfunding starting to become a useful channel for private companies to raise capital. I'll give you an example. Um, Republic is a mainstream crowdfunding platform. So if you were building an ice cream company, you could go on that platform and use what's called Regulation CF and raise up to $5 million through individual retail investors that are investing as little as $25. And the platform will aggregate all of that. Well, we've seen cannabis companies go into platforms like that and raise millions of dollars through the crowdfunding regulation. And these companies are usually consumer-based cannabis companies that have affinity groups, users of their products. And so that this is an emerging way for cannabis companies, private companies, to raise capital, knowing that mainstream capital is just not available right now.
Interesting, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah. Well, I think that there's so much that we need to do right now to bring more fairness into the cannabis industry. I think it's been lacking for a long time. But again, I don't think it'll happen really until we have sort of a changing of the guards in Congress, both at the congressional and the Senate level.
I agree.
Yeah. And everyone was so afraid that Jeff Sessions would put the kibosh on the entire industry. And there were a lot of threats that happened during his time. And it seems as though AG Barr isn't really quite as interested in doing any damage to the cannabis industry, but he certainly hasn't helped it. Let's put it that way.
Yes, I agree. It was great we got through the whole Sessions period, but I think the administration and just Congress in general, they've all agreed to just keep the rider going, where no federal funds will be used to interfere with legal state operations. And I know that Trump is really pushing it off to the states. So I feel like the industry is going to be protected no matter who is in office. But I do see an opportunity, if there's a change, for more regardless if there's a change federally, more states, I see more states going legal. The coronavirus has stymied a few states like New York that had planned to do it earlier, but now their budget's depleted. But I think it's going to be a net positive in the end, because when we're through this, a lot of states are going to be hurting in terms of their budgets, and they're going to see other states making big tax receipts from having legal state programs. So I think it's going to be a net positive. I think more states are going to go legal. And I think next year we could even see, depending on who's in office, the SAFE Act, the Banking Act, move through Congress, and then hopefully at some point when that happens, really open up a federal regime and make it federally legal.
Yeah, it's inevitable. It's no longer a matter of if, but when, and just getting through some of the red tape of doing it. There's also another sweeping reform bill that has sailed through the Judiciary Committee and is now awaiting a floor vote. And I have a feeling that COVID is interrupting that process as well. Everything is up in the air right now, isn't it? Yeah. So, gosh. Well, I think it'll be particularly interesting when things do open up legally to see what happens to the media and the reporting and how audiences will respond to it and how the demand will fluctuate. And especially now that we're seeing a lot of prices drop in the CBD market, especially, in hemp.
Yeah.
It used to be that hemp could command a much higher price than it can today. What do you think about that? Do you think that the laws opening up will actually help to bring the prices back up so that it's worth the while of hemp farmers to continue to grow the crop?
Yeah, that's a great point. And it goes back to what I was saying about the demand. It is a supply and demand scenario where I think what happened is when the Farm Bill passed in 2018, like anything, it created a lot of exuberance. And I think that the hemp farmers overbuilt. And at the back end of it, the consumer, the FDA wasn't given clarity. And so they were growing all this hemp, but there wasn't enough demand for that in CBD products. And so I see that supply and demand normalizing once the FDA can come out and say that CBD is a supplement, can be treated like a vitamin, and give clear guidance in marketing, selling, and using CBD. And I think when that happens, you'll have a spike, a sustained spike in demand. And then I think prices will rise again. And hemp farmers probably have learned a lot. And I think you'll have a market that will normalize where hemp farmers, it'll make sense for them to start growing again.
Yeah. And what about, are you reporting anything on the infrastructure build out for products other than CBD using biomass of hemp?
We haven't touched on that too much. What are you seeing in that regard?
Well, I see that there's a demand for hemp products that can help to diminish the dependence on fossil fuels.
Right, on the industrial side.
On the industrial side, yeah.
Yeah, I know that there are companies that really want to use hemp to replace plastics in cars, and all kinds of uses. And I think that that was one of the intentions of the Farm Bill, was to allow the industrialization of it as a product. We haven't covered that too much, but I'm hoping that that is a good outcome, because I know it'll be good for the environment, and it will also allow a new set of companies to thrive.
Yeah, absolutely. And, aside from the obvious, reducing of the carbon emissions and doing away with a lot of the chemicals that are being used to grow the crops that are processed into biofuel right now, the Roundup Ready corn, for example, which is poisoning our water tables. Don't even get me started on that. It's a big mess, but hemp can be grown more sustainably than cotton as well, and produce textiles that are far more durable than cotton and cleaner than cotton and don't cause so many health problems. So it'll be interesting to see. I'd really like to see a bigger push on that as much as CBD in Congress, getting the incentives built out, because there's no reason for us to be giving $11 billion tax break to Exxon, for example, when hemp companies could be making biofuel and making plastics and all of the other things that are made out of fossil fuels.
Exactly. And I hope there's a charismatic leader in this, almost like an Elon Musk has been to electric cars
Mhm.
and now space travel. I hope that a charismatic figure emerges in that space that can show America in the media that using hemp derived products is a benefit. And I
Yeah.
think we're missing that.
Yeah. Yeah. A champion. We needed a champion. For a while there, I thought it would be someone like Sir Richard Branson, or
Yes.
he's been an advocate of cannabis law reform for a long time. So, in case he's out there listening someplace, let's hope that, yeah, someone needs to take the lead. I mean, Henry Ford back in the day really tried.
Yes.
He had built out a car that was made mainly with hemp composites, and he grew hemp himself and used hemp to make his biofuel. So we need that in this country. So what else do you have a burning desire for our audiences to know?
It's that we are, the challenge of this industry, I always tell people, is there's a lot of promise, but oftentimes it's a kind of a two-step forward, one step back analogy. But I do believe that things like COVID, although it's such a bad thing, it's really changed the perception of cannabis from really being illegal to essential
Mhm.
in many ways. And I think when COVID's done, these cannabis companies have found new ways to get their products to consumers: curbside pickup, delivery. I really think it's going to accelerate how the industry